Hey everybody, this is Miss Peachy again for this time Unit 3, Lesson 10. We are looking at the plant cycle. We have been looking at body systems, and one of the body systems is the reproductive system. So we are looking at all living things, not just animals. So for this lesson, we're actually going to be looking at the body system of reproduction from the plant's point of view. So plant reproduction here. And it brings back a lot of things we've learned about already. So they don't have a vocab list for some reason in this lesson. I did put together just a bolded list of vocab words for you to define in our note sheet for this one. But some of those vocab words you already know, although there are a few new ones as well. So the first term that is new is known as alternation of generations, and that is specifically the type of life cycle that plants have. It's a two-generation life cycle. It alternates between a haploid generation and a diploid generation. So let's remind ourselves what those terms mean. Haploid means that you have half the number of chromosomes. So for example, in animals, sperm and egg cells are haploid cells. Believe it or not, plants also have sperm and egg cells. But that's just one component of what part of their body is haploid. In animals, it's literally just the sperm and egg cells. In plants, they have a whole physical part of them that is also haploid. But diploid cells contain all the chromosomes found within the organism. So they have two sets of each chromosome. So then we talk about gametes. And gametes in humans are the only haploid cells. In plants, that's not true. But gametes specifically refer to sperm and egg cells. They are a type of haploid cell, which again in animals is the only type of haploid cell. But in plants, there are different kinds of haploid cells as well. During the process of fertilization, the sperm will fuse with an egg to create a diploid cell known as a zygote. Now here, fertilization is spelled as though we are British, so I feel like we should be saying it with a British accent. So during the process of fertilization, the sperm cell fuses with the egg cell to form a zygote. So generally in the United States, we spell fertilization with a Z, not with an S. I'm not sure why the graphic has an S here, but it's the same word. It's just spelled a little bit differently than we would typically spell it here in the US of A. So we have our sperm cell and our egg cell, each in the case of humans, right, with 23 chromosomes fusing together to create a single cell known as a zygote. And a zygote is the very first cell of a new baby. So that zygote will go on to divide using mitosis, not meiosis, and make more copies of itself. It will start to differentiate into different types of cells, and then a new organism will eventually arise from that first cell known as a zygote. So let's compare and contrast mitosis with meiosis, shall we? So they sound a lot alike. They're both processes of cell division, and they both go through similar phases. They go through prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase for both mitosis and meiosis. The big differences are which cells go through them, and what types of cells arise from them, and then the process itself. Like mitosis is single division, meiosis is double division. In both situations, the cell first starts off by replicating its DNA. That actually happens in a different part of the cell cycle, but the cell begins with a double set of DNA. With mitosis, you are starting off with 96 and just dividing once, or sorry, 92 and just dividing once to get two that are 46 each. With meiosis, you start off with 96 and you divide twice to get four that are 23 each. So there's your difference. They both start off with a double set of chromosomes, but with meiosis, you get two divisions. You get meiosis 1 and meiosis 2, and you end up with 4 haploid cells at the end. With mitosis, you only have a single cell division, which gives you 2 daughter cells that each have 46. There's some other differences in there too. Remember, with mitosis, you literally have exact copies. So it's more of a cloning process. With meiosis, you have crossing over that takes place during prophase, which results in some genetic variation. And you also have that independent assortment. That means that, the alleles are going to randomly assort into different ones of these gametes at the end, and so you have some variation there too. So you have variation that occurs or is introduced in meiosis that doesn't happen in mitosis. So there's our compare and contrast. With plants have two complete halves of their life cycle. They have the haploid part and the diploid part of their life cycle. They have two different kind of separate parts of their organism. They have what's known as the gametophyte and the sporophyte. The gametophyte is the part of the plant that is haploid. That means that every part of that gametophyte contains only half the number of chromosomes as the mature organism does. And the gametophyte's purpose is to produce eggs and sperm. That's what its purpose is to do. When you look at a simple organism like a moss, the majority of the body that you see is actually a gametophyte. So the fuzzy, mossy part of moss is haploid. That's that greenish, fuzzy part that forms a really soft, cushiony carpet when you step on it with your bare feet in the forest. It's beautiful. I love moss. But that's gametophytes. These are plants that produce gametes. So let's just look at the suffix here, phyte, P-H-Y-T-E. This refers to plant. And gameto, the prefix, refers to gametes. So it's the part of the plant that makes gametes, egg and sperm. That's what it does. The actual function of that portion of the plant is in the name of that portion of the plant. That's the beauty of using these Latin roots. They're kind of tricky to learn and they may not make lots of sense at first, but as soon as you kind of understand what the meanings of these are, then the word itself has meaning and it's not just a name anymore. The brown part here of this moss is known as the sporophyte. You guessed it. It is the part of the plant that makes spores. It is also the diploid portion. So a plant like a moss, it doesn't make seeds like, say, a flower does, right? A moss will make spores, and they're kind of like seeds. They're kind of like little tiny little seeds, but they're not exactly seeds because they don't have like the same stuff that seeds have in them, but they do have a small like little embryo inside of them. And so when they make these spores, the spores blow away in the wind and they find a place to land and they grow into a brand new gametophyte, a brand new moss plant. And so that is the kind of the end result of reproduction in the moss. So what we see here in this weird little cycle picture is you kind of see that happening. So you've got this, let's see here, you've got these gametophytes that are growing. That's the mossy part. That's that fuzzy, beautiful, fuzzy, softy part. They're growing and they produce eggs and sperm. Believe it or not, little mossy parts, there's little boy mossy parts and there's little girl mossy parts. And they each produce their respective gametes, egg and sperm. And they produce those egg and sperm and they meet together in the water. They'll swim together and they fertilize and they create a zygote. And then the zygote grows into the sporophyte. Remember, the zygote is diploid, so it grows into that brown little guy right there. That's after all that mitosis happens now to make a new baby. The sporophyte is the new baby. The sporophyte then grows up produces this capsule, releases spores, which then go on to grow into new gametophytes. And the process continues and life goes on, as they say, right? So that is the life cycle of your fern, or not your fern, your moss. Ferns do the same thing, but just a little differences. So here's our moss. So we see the same, I'm going ahead here, the same alternation of generation in mosses. Here's our sperm, our fern. Here's our fern. They're producing egg and sperm too, right? But the difference here is now the gametophyte is the smaller part. So as we're getting more complex with our plants, the gametophyte gets smaller and the sporophyte becomes kind of the dominant part of the plant. So the fern part that you're familiar with is the sporophyte. It's the mature diploid organism. The gametophyte you probably really don't see very much. It's generally very small and hard to see. It looks kind of like a little flat disc like this. And this gametophyte produces the egg and sperm that fertilize and make a zygote, right? That zygote then grows into these little, I love those when they first come up like that, they're all curly. That's your sporophyte. It grows bigger and bigger and bigger and it produces spores. And if you ever look at a fern, you can actually see those spores on them. Those sporangium, they call them, they release spores. And those spores then go and they find a new place to grow new gametophytes. Same process as in mosses, just now as your organism becomes a bit more complicated, the gametophyte gets smaller, the sporophyte gets bigger. And when we get to things like trees and flowers and stuff, you still have gametophytes. They're just so small that you don't see that part of it. This is kind of, I don't like this picture because this is kind of not really showing that fertilization process because we really need to look inside the flower. And I'm going to just give me 1 second. I'm going to show you a better picture. All right, so what I wanted to show you here was a better picture, I think, to kind of illustrate that we still have the alternation of generations happening in a flowering plant. This is a flower, but all trees that produce apples are flowering plants. We call these guys angiosperms or anthophytes, depending on whether you're looking at, which kind of level of classification you're looking at. But get a little bigger here. This isn't the clearest picture, but it's a good picture. So we see the different parts of the plant. Plants can have flowers, and either the flower has both male and female parts in the same flower, or some plants actually have male and female flowers, so they're on separate flowers. But the idea is that there are eggs that are produced within the plant itself, okay, right inside the receptacle here, which is attached to the style and the stigma of the plant. There's your female parts. And inside we have eggs, and those eggs are haploid, and they are produced by the gametophyte of the plant. But it's microscopic at this point. Now we're talking about a microscopic gametophyte. In the anther and the stamen over here, anther, and let's see here, we got the different parts that are. The stamen is the anther and the filament. So the filament here and then the anther's on top. Pollen is produced, and pollen contains sperm, and that is produced by the male gametophyte. Again, microscopic. So the male gametophyte produces pollen. The pollen contains sperm. The pollen lands on the stigma, and then the pollen actually opens up, and the sperm come out, and they create this, well, I should say this, the pollen actually first opens up, releases a pollen tube. A little tube grows and works its way down through the style here. And then the sperm swim down the pollen tube into the receptacle and they fertilize an egg inside. And it's actually something we'll get into later. It's called double fertilization. And so it's a little bit more complex than other plants. but you literally do have a fusion of sperm and egg that's occurring inside flowering plants as well. You still have the gametophyte producing the gametes, and you still have, in this case, we don't have a sporophyte. The sporophyte, if you will, is the entire flower itself because they're not producing spores, but they're producing seeds. These are seed-bearing plants. They're a little different. Seeds are a kind of evolutionary step above um, spores in that the little embryo now has food and seeds can be kind of they can be spread and they can remain dormant for a while and it will still survive, whereas spores have to grow pretty much immediately. So they're a little different, but they still have the same function. And the whole plant itself is still the sporophyte. It's just that they're not producing spores. Okay. So here's our tree, which is still considered to be our sporophyte. In fact, everything here, with the exception of the microscopic gametophytes found in the ovaries and found within those anthers, are sporophytes. Otherwise, but you still have the sperm and the eggs that are fertilizing to produce your seeds in those. So that's your major differences between your life cycles of plants. When you look at plants like mosses and ferns, these guys need water as a part of their life cycle. It's very, very important because in order for that sperm to be able to swim to the egg, it has to have something to swim to or swim through. And it's swimming through the water that is in that moist environment of the forest floor, or generally in a wetland type of an environment is where you're going to find mosses and ferns. Wet forest floors, wetlands, marshy type areas, bogs, and stuff like that. Whereas plants that produce seeds or are flowering plants specifically, they don't need to have that because the pollen actually grows those pollen tubes that allows the sperm to swim to the eggs. All right, so that is pretty much the end of this lesson, the plant life cycles. Hopefully that helped a little bit with the understanding of the lesson. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in the next one.